What if the person you thought you knew had lived a life filled with sacrifices you could never imagine? That was the unspoken question hanging in the air as the crowd gathered at Cypress Grove Cemetery. It was a bright afternoon, the sun casting a soft golden glow over the freshly dug grave. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the surrounding oak trees, but the quiet hum of nature did little to soften the heavy weight of the occasion. Friends, family, and acquaintances stood together in solemn silence, their faces etched with sadness and quiet reflection. They had come to pay their respects to Robert Henley, a man known in the community for his generosity, quiet strength, and unwavering kindness. His legacy of service was reflected even on the polished black headstone, which bore the simple yet profound inscription, "A life of service and sacrifice." Among the mourners stood an elderly woman who, despite her quiet presence, seemed to command the attention of the space around her. She wore a deep green dress, modest in cut, and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her silver hair from the sun. In her hands, she held a single red rose, its vibrant color standing in sharp contrast to the muted tones of the cemetery. Though her hands were steady, her eyes betrayed the weight of the moment, a depth of grief and knowing that went far beyond the collective mourning of the crowd. Few people noticed her, and even fewer acknowledged her presence. To most, she was simply another mourner, blending into the background of loss and quiet reflection. As the pastor concluded his final prayer, a hush fell over the crowd. The woman stepped forward, the sound of gravel crunching beneath her heels drawing the attention of those around her. Heads turned as she approached the casket, her steps deliberate and unhurried. She knelt slightly, placing the rose gently atop the gleaming wood. For a moment she lingered, her hand resting against the smooth surface. Then, with quiet resolve, she turned to face the crowd. "My name is Hattie Delaney," she said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that cut through the silence. "I doubt many of you know me, but I knew Robert better than anyone here." A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Faces turned toward each other, brows furrowing in confusion. Who was this woman? How could she claim to have known Robert so deeply when none of them had ever heard her name before? Robert had been a public figure, a man of influence and respect. Surely someone so close to him would have been known to his inner circle. Hattie's gaze swept across the crowd, her expression steady but unreadable. "Before today ends," she continued, her voice steady and clear, "you will understand why I am here, and you will know the Robert Henley most of you never knew." Her words hung in the air, charged with quiet intensity. The polished version of Robert Henley they had known, the kind man, the generous neighbor, the well-respected figure, was about to be redefined. And as Hattie prepared to speak, the weight of what was about to be revealed settled over the crowd like a gathering storm. Hattie's gaze lingered on the crowd for a long moment, her expression calm but layered with a quiet strength. The weight of her words still hung in the air, the disbelief etched into the faces of those gathered around the grave. She took a slow breath, steadying herself before continuing. "I met Robert 50 years ago," Hattie said, her voice soft yet clear. "Long before most of you knew him as the generous man he became." A few murmurs swept through the crowd, but Hattie pressed on. Her eyes became distant, lost in the memory of another time. "It was in Montgomery, Alabama," she said, her tone threading with both pride and quiet sorrow. "During a time when men like Robert and women like me weren't supposed to cross paths. He was a young man back then, sharp, restless, filled with conviction. I met him at a church on Dexter Avenue. We were organizing sit-ins, and Robert was one of the few white men willing to stand with us." Gasps rippled through the group. The idea of Robert Henley, polished, refined, and respected, actively participating in the civil rights movement, seemed impossible to many of them. But Hattie's tone left no room for doubt. "Robert knew the risk," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "He lost friends, he was threatened, his family tried to convince him to walk away, but he never did." Her hand brushed lightly against the brim of her hat, her gaze softening. "But our connection wasn't just about the fight, it was deeper than that." A sharp tension spread through the crowd as the implication of her words settled in. Hattie's voice lowered, drawing them in. "We became close," she said, "closer than anyone knew. We shared meals, stories, and our fears. He would visit me after long nights of protest, sometimes with bruises from the police, other times just exhausted from carrying the weight of it all. And I was there for him when the world turned cold. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. A woman near the front shifted uncomfortably, her hand clutching her husband's arm. The polished image of Robert Henley was beginning to fracture. But our relationship wasn't accepted, Hattie continued, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her words. We lived in a world where love like ours was condemned. Robert was pressured by his family, his community, his church. He knew that if our relationship became public, it wouldn't just ruin his reputation, it would end his career and everything he had built. She paused, her eyes flicking toward the casket. So we kept it quiet. We didn't deny what we were to each other, but we never spoke it aloud beyond the walls of my home. The crowd's energy shifted, faces darkened with quiet shame, others with quiet curiosity. I loved Robert, Hattie said, her voice catching slightly on the words. And he loved me, but he paid a price for that love. His family distanced themselves from him. He was passed over for promotions, he was ridiculed in whispers, but still he stayed. Her gaze sharpened, and I stayed too, because real love isn't about convenience, it's about sacrifice. The weight of her admission settled over the cemetery like a heavy fog. Hattie's eyes shimmered with restrained emotion, but her expression remained calm, unflinching. And that's the truth about Robert Henley, Hattie said, her tone quiet but cutting through the crowd with precision. The man you thought you knew gave everything for the people he loved, even when it cost him more than any of you could imagine. She stepped back from the grave, her posture straight despite the vulnerability of her words. The crowd stood frozen, still processing what they had just heard. The Robert Henley they had known was generous, kind, and honorable. But the man Hattie described, the man who loved in secret and suffered in silence, was more complicated, more human, and infinitely more powerful. I stood by his side until the end, Hattie said, and now you finally know why. Hattie's gaze softened as she stepped back from the casket, the weight of her confession lingering in the thick, charged air. The crowd remained silent, stunned by the revelation of her relationship with Robert. But Hattie wasn't finished. There was more to their story, more than sacrifice and secrecy. It was about a bond that endured through storms and silence, a connection that neither time nor circumstance could break. We weren't just two people caught up in a difficult time, Hattie said, her voice steady but laced with quiet emotion. We built a life together in the only way we could. Her eyes drifted toward the polished wood of Robert's casket. After Robert lost his job for marching in Selma, he didn't run from it. He stood his ground. He moved into a small house on the south side of Montgomery, not far from where I lived. We were careful, of course. The world wasn't kind to relationships like ours, but that didn't stop him from showing up. Her gaze sharpened, her chin lifting slightly. He showed up when my home was attacked. He showed up when my sister passed away. He showed up when others walked away. Hattie's hand brushed against the pearl necklace resting at her throat. A subtle smile flickered across her lips. You see, she continued, Robert wasn't just there for the hard times. He was there for the quiet moments too. On Sundays after church, he would come by with fresh peaches from the market because he knew they were my favorite. We'd sit on the porch, the sun setting behind us, and we wouldn't even have to speak. Just sitting next to each other was enough. Her smile deepened, though her eyes glimmered with quiet pain. And he would listen. Lord, did he listen? He listened when I was angry, when I was scared, when I doubted that we'd ever live in a world where people like us could love openly. He didn't always have the answers, but he never stopped listening. Her gaze swept the crowd, resting briefly on faces now softened with understanding. When I was asked to speak today, I knew I couldn't stand here and give you the version of Robert you wanted to hear. The polished version, the easy version. Hattie's brow furrowed, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Because that would dishonor the man he truly was. The silence grew heavier. No one moved. Robert wasn't perfect, Hattie admitted. He carried guilt over the things he couldn't fix, over the people he couldn't save. He worried that he hadn't done enough, even when he gave more than most men would in 10 lifetimes. Her lips pressed together. But he never let that guilt define him. He faced it. He sat with it. And then he kept going. Hattie's hands tightened slightly around the edge of her purse. Her eyes darkened with memory. "There was a night in 1968, she said, her voice lowering. "I had just gotten word that one of our friends, a young man who had marched with us, had been beaten nearly to death. I was angry. I told Robert that I didn't think I could keep fighting anymore, that maybe it was time to walk away." Her breath trembled slightly as she recounted the memory. "Robert didn't try to talk me out of it," she said. "He sat next to me on that porch, took my hand in his, and he said, 'Hattie, you don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to carry this alone. But if you choose to walk away, you need to know that I'll keep walking for the both of us.'" Her gaze sharpened, tears flickering behind her eyes. That was Robert. Steady, unshakable. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need praise. He was the type of man who fought quietly, without demanding attention. Because he knew the fight wasn't about him, it was about the people who would come after him. Hattie's eyes scanned the crowd again, searching their faces. Some were openly crying now. Others simply stared at the ground, shame curling around the edges of their silence. "That's why I stood by him," Hattie said. "Through the years of whispers and judgment, through the loneliness, through the times when it felt like the whole world was against us." She straightened, her shoulders squared with quiet dignity. Because love isn't about convenience. It's not about recognition. It's about showing up. Robert showed up for me when it was dangerous, when it was hard, when it cost him more than any of you will ever know. A heavy breath escaped her lips as she steadied herself. "And that's why I stayed." Hattie's expression softened, her voice lowering. "We built a life together, even if the world refused to see it. We shared a love that survived in the shadows, a bond that couldn't be broken by time, distance, or silence." Her hand brushed against the polished edge of the casket, her gaze lingering there. "And I promise you this Robert didn't leave this world alone. I was with him until the very end, just as he had been there for me from the very beginning." Hattie took a small step back, her chin lifting despite the glimmer of tears in her eyes. "You thought you knew Robert Henley," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But now you know the truth, and I hope you'll remember him not for the man you imagined, but for the man he truly was." She stepped away from the grave, the quiet weight of her words lingering in the air long after her voice had faded. Hattie's fingers trembled slightly as she reached into her purse. The weight of what she was about to share pressed against her chest, but her gaze remained steady. The crowd's quiet murmurs faded into silence as they watched her pull out a small, weathered envelope. Its edges were soft with age, the ink on the front slightly faded, but the name written there, Hattie DeLay, was still perfectly legible. "This," Hattie said, her voice soft but deliberate, "is a letter Robert wrote to me in 1972. He gave it to me on a night when he wasn't sure if he'd live to see another day." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Faces that had once been guarded now softened with quiet curiosity. Hattie's hands steadied as she carefully unfolded the letter. She had read it countless times over the years, each word etched into her memory. But today, the weight of those words felt heavier. She cleared her throat, her voice carrying through the cool afternoon air. "Hattie," she began, her tone low and measured. "You are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear, but I would carry them again for you without hesitation. You remind me every day that love is not about blood, it's about who stands beside you when the world turns its back." Hattie paused, her breath hitching slightly as the memory of that night resurfaced. "I don't know if I'll be here tomorrow, Hattie. The threats have been getting worse. Every time I walk out the door, I wonder if it'll be the last time I see you. But if that day comes, I need you to know this. You were my strength. You kept me standing when I didn't think I could anymore. You made me brave." Her voice wavered for a moment before she steadied herself. "I don't regret a single moment. Not the fear, not the pain, not the cost. Because I had you. And if this fight takes me, I'll know it was worth it because you were standing beside me." A hush fell over the cemetery as Hattie's eyes lifted from the letter. Her gaze swept across the mourners, some of whom now stood with tears slipping down their cheeks. Even those who had looked skeptical at the start were visibly moved. "You see," Hattie said, her voice low but carrying across the space, "Robert didn't just fight for justice because it was the right thing to do. He fought because he believed in the people he loved. He fought because he wanted to make the world better for them, even if it cost him his peace, his safety, or his future." Her hands folded the letter carefully, her touch reverent. "And it did cost him," she added, "more than any of you knew." Hattie's gaze darkened slightly. He carried that burden quietly. He never asked for recognition or sympathy. He fought his battles in the shadows so the rest of us could walk in the light. Her hand brushed against the smooth surface of the casket, her expression softening. "I wasn't the only one he protected," Hattie said, her eyes glinting with quiet pride, "but I was the one who knew his heart." The letter rested in her palm, a fragile piece of paper that held decades of sacrifice and devotion. She closed her hand around it and stepped back from the casket, her shoulders straight and her chin lifted. "You didn't know this, Robert," she said, "but you do now." And as the silence settled over the cemetery, the weight of her words remained a quiet testament to a man who had loved and fought without asking for anything in return. Hattie took a steady breath, her hand brushing once more against the smooth wood of the casket. The letter had laid bare Robert's heart, but there was more, something deeper, more painful, that had shaped the man he had become. The crowd's silence was heavy, expectant. She knew what she was about to say would change the way they remembered Robert forever. "You've heard about the battles Robert fought in public," Hattie said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of hard truths. "But there was one sacrifice he made that none of you ever knew about, a sacrifice that cost him more than any threat, any protest, or any injury." She paused, her gaze scanning the faces before her. The crowd was still, eyes wide, some leaning forward as if drawn by the pull of her voice. "In 1968, she continued, Robert had a son." Gasps rippled through the mourners. Faces turned toward each other in quiet disbelief. A few people shook their heads as if they had misheard. Robert Henley, a man of measured dignity, known for his calm authority, had a secret child? Hattie's expression didn't soften. Her eyes darkened with memory. The boy's name was Samuel. He was born to a woman Robert loved deeply. But the world wouldn't have accepted that love, not then, not the way things were. She exhaled slowly, the memory pressing hard against her chest. Samuel's mother was a black woman, and Robert was white. In Montgomery, Alabama, in the late 1960s, that wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Murmurs swept through the crowd, but Hattie pressed on. Robert knew what it would mean if the truth came out. He knew it could ruin his career, could make him a target, could put Samuel and his mother in danger. And so he made a decision that broke his heart. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides. "He stayed away," Hattie said, her voice low and raw. "Not because he didn't love Samuel, but because he knew that if anyone found out, the backlash would fall hardest on his son. He sacrificed his right to raise his child to protect him." Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "But make no mistake," she continued, "Robert loved that boy. He supported Samuel's mother in every way he could. He sent money every month. He paid for Samuel's schooling, his clothes, his books. And when Samuel was old enough to understand, Robert wrote to him. Letters full of pride and longing, letters that Samuel kept." Hattie's gaze sharpened, but Robert never claimed his son publicly. He bore that shame so Samuel wouldn't have to. He let the world believe he was alone because it was the only way to protect his son from the hate Robert knew too well. A quiet tear slid down her cheek as she glanced toward the back of the crowd. "And Samuel," Hattie said, her tone gentler now, "is here today." The crowd parted slowly as a tall man stepped forward. His dark suit was crisp, his broad shoulders squared with quiet strength. He was striking, his features a blend of his mother's grace and Robert's unmistakable presence. Samuel's gaze swept over the crowd before settling on Hattie. His eyes glinted with quiet emotion as he stepped toward her. Hattie reached out, squeezing his hand. "This," she said, her voice soft but firm, "is Robert Henley's greatest legacy." Samuel's gaze dropped to the casket. His jaw tightened as he took a breath, then he lifted his head to face the mourners. "My father couldn't be with me," Samuel said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "But he was always there. Every letter, Every call, every sacrifice, he gave everything to protect me. The crowd stood frozen, the gravity of Samuel's presence shifting the air between them. You all knew Robert as a leader, a man of dignity, Samuel continued, but I knew him as a father. A quiet, constant presence even when he couldn't be there. Hattie smiled faintly, pride shining in her eyes. Robert carried that burden alone, Hattie said, her voice low but steady. He let the world misunderstand him because he knew that protecting Samuel meant more than protecting his reputation. Samuel's gaze darkened slightly. He could have claimed me, he said. He could have made a statement. But he knew that the cost wouldn't fall on him, it would fall on me. And so, he stayed in the shadows because that's what real love looks like. Hattie's breath trembled as she placed a hand on Samuel's arm. He gave up his right to be a father in public, she said. But behind closed doors, he loved his son more fiercely than the world will ever know. The crowd's collective silence was thick with emotion. Tears slid down more than a few faces as the truth of Robert's sacrifice settled over them. Samuel stepped closer to the casket, his hand resting gently on the polished wood. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly, "for loving me enough to let me go." Hattie's gaze softened. "He never let you go, Samuel," she whispered. "He just carried you differently." Samuel's hand lingered on the casket before he stepped back, his shoulders lifting with quiet strength. Hattie turned back toward the crowd. "That," she said, her voice sharp again, "is the Robert Henley you didn't know." The weight of her words settled over the mourners, leaving behind an ache of quiet reverence. Because now they understood the true cost of Robert's devotion, the depth of his sacrifice, and for the first time, they truly saw the man they had come to honor. Hattie stood beside Samuel, her hand still resting on his arm as the weight of her last words settled over the crowd. The revelation of Robert's sacrifice had left the mourners visibly shaken, but there was more, a final chapter in Robert's story that would redefine the way they remembered him forever. Hattie's gaze sharpened as she took a small step forward, her expression resolute. "There's one last thing you need to know," she said, her voice steady despite the swell of emotion beneath it. Robert's greatest gift wasn't the life he lived, it was the future he secured for others. The crowd's eyes followed her as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, sealed with a faded wax emblem. Hattie held it up for them to see. "2 months before Robert passed," Hattie continued, "he called me. He was tired, and I knew he didn't have much time left, but his mind wasn't on himself, it was on this community, on the people he spent his life fighting for." She unfolded the letter, her hand steady despite the tremor in her breath. "Robert knew he couldn't protect everyone," she said, "but he was determined to give them the chance to stand on their own." Hattie's eyes softened as she began to read from the letter. "Hattie, I know my time is running out, but there's one last thing I need to do. I've lived long enough to know that real change takes more than speeches or protests, it takes opportunity. I've set aside everything I have left for that purpose. When I'm gone, I want it used to build something that lasts. A scholarship fund for the children in this community. After-school programs, mentorships. Let them know they're seen. Let them know they matter. If I couldn't give them a better world, let me at least give them the tools to shape one for themselves." Hattie's voice faltered slightly as she lowered the letter. Her gaze swept across the mourners. Robert's estate, the house, the land, the investments, he left it all to the people who need it most. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some exchanged shocked glances, others simply stood frozen in disbelief. "He didn't leave it to his family," Hattie clarified. "He didn't leave it to some foundation with his name etched on a plaque. He left it to the children of this community, the ones whose names you'll never read in the papers, the ones who've been forgotten by everyone else." Samuel's jaw tightened, his gaze darkening with quiet pride. "The scholarship fund has already been established," he said, stepping forward. "It's in my father's name. It's not just for tuition, it's for books, housing, meals, and mentorship. My father wanted to make sure that no child would have to walk the path he did alone." The crowd stirred, the weight of Robert's final gift sinking in. Hattie's eyes glinted with fierce pride. "Robert didn't care about being remembered," she said. "He cared about building something that would outlast him." Tears shone in Samuel's eyes as he added, "That was my father's legacy. Not the wealth he left behind, but the doors he opened for those who would have never been given a chance." A woman near the front of the crowd stepped forward, her hands trembling. "My daughter just got into college," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but we didn't know how we were going to afford it." Samuel's gaze softened. "You don't have to worry anymore," he said. "That's exactly why this fund exists." A man near the back cleared his throat. His eyes were red, his hands trembling. "I always thought Robert was generous, but I didn't know he was like this." "You didn't know," Hattie said gently, "because he didn't want you to know. He didn't do it for recognition, he did it because it was right." The crowd's collective realization settled like a quiet storm. They had come to this funeral to mourn a man they thought they understood. But now, they were beginning to grasp the depth of Robert's life, not just in the things he had accomplished, but in the sacrifices he had made and the lives he had quietly lifted along the way. Samuel's hand brushed the edge of the casket. "My father gave more than any of us realized," he said. "He gave quietly. He gave when no one was watching. And he gave knowing that it might cost him everything." Hattie's gaze softened as she watched the understanding ripple through the crowd. "He gave," she said, "because he believed that legacy isn't about what you leave behind, it's about what you give away." A long silence stretched across the cemetery, broken only by the distant sound of birdsong. The weight of Robert's final act settled over them like a quiet benediction. Then Samuel stepped forward, his hand resting on Hattie's shoulder. "My father knew that strength wasn't about power," he said. "It was about using what you have to lift others." Hattie smiled faintly. "And that," she said, "is why Robert Henley will never truly be gone." The crowd stood in reverent silence, the finality of Robert's life softened by the realization that his influence would continue long after his death. His sacrifice, his quiet courage, his relentless belief in the people he fought for, it would echo through generations. And as Hattie and Samuel turned toward the casket one last time, the afternoon sun cut through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the polished wood. It was as if Robert himself was offering a quiet blessing. "He gave us everything," Hattie whispered, "and he asked for nothing in return." The truth of Robert's legacy settled in the hearts of everyone present, a legacy not measured in wealth or status, but in the lives he had lifted, the burdens he had carried, and the future he had secured for others. And that, Hattie knew, was how Robert Henley would be remembered. The silence that followed Hattie's final words was not empty. It was weighted with realization and quiet reverence. The mourners stood frozen in place, processing the magnitude of what they had just learned. Their understanding of Robert Henley had been upended. The polished image of the well-respected philanthropist was now layered with depth, sacrifice, and quiet bravery. They had come to pay respects to a man they thought they knew. Now they stood before the truth of a life that had been far more complex and profound than they had imagined. A middle-aged man near the front of the crowd shifted uneasily, his eyes wet with tears. "I always thought Robert had it easy," he said softly, his voice trembling. "He was always so composed, so successful. But I had no idea what it had cost him." Beside him, an elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a trembling hand. "I thought I knew him," she whispered, shaking her head. "He always helped when someone was in trouble, but I never thought to ask about his own struggles. I should have asked. I should have known." Hattie's gaze softened as she watched the weight of understanding settle over them. This was what Robert had known all along, that people rarely looked past the surface. They saw what they wanted to see. They admired success without questioning the price it had cost. And Robert had accepted that burden without complaint, knowing that his strength lay not in being understood, but in standing firm when no one else could. Samuel stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared, his presence echoing the quiet dignity of his father. "My father wasn't a complicated man," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "He never needed recognition or praise. He believed that doing the right thing was enough." His gaze swept the crowd. "But now you know the truth. You know the sacrifices he made and the burdens he carried so that others wouldn't have to." A ripple of guilt passed through the group. Many of them had benefited from Robert's quiet generosity, loans that were never repaid, job recommendations that had opened doors, quiet assistance during personal crises. And yet, they had never thought to ask where that generosity came from, or why Robert had been so willing to give without asking for anything in return. "I was one of them," a woman near the back of the crowd said. Her voice wavered with quiet shame. "Robert helped me when my husband left, paid my mortgage for 6 months, so I wouldn't lose the house. I thanked him at the time, but I thought it was just because he could afford to." Samuel's gaze softened. "He could have kept that money for himself," he said. "But that's not who he was. He believed that what you have is only valuable if you use it to lift others." The man near the front shook his head. "We saw his success," he said. "We admired it, but we didn't see the work beneath it, the pain, the losses." His jaw tightened, and we didn't ask. Hattie's gaze sharpened. "Robert didn't expect you to ask," she said gently, "but he hoped you'd learn from his example." The crowd fell silent again, their shame giving way to quiet reflection. Some began to nod. Others wiped at their eyes. The weight of guilt was still present, but it was shifting into something else, understanding, and perhaps the beginning of change. Samuel's hand curled around the edge of the casket. "My father once told me that strength isn't about how much you can carry, it's about how much you're willing to let go of for the sake of someone else." His voice softened. He gave so much of himself to this community, and he never asked for anything in return. A young man near the back spoke up, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "Then maybe it's time we give something back." Heads turned toward him. The crowd began to shift, no longer fragmented, but unified under the weight of Robert's legacy. Samuel smiled faintly. "That's exactly what my father would have wanted." The older man near the front lifted his head. "We can honor him," he said. "Not just by remembering him, but by living the way he did. By helping others, even when it's not convenient. By seeing people instead of judging them." Hattie's eyes gleamed with quiet pride. "That," she said, "is how Robert will truly live on." The mood in the crowd was changing. Where there had been shame, there was now quiet resolve. The truth about Robert Henley had not diminished him in their eyes, it had elevated him. They had admired his success before. Now, they respected his sacrifice. Samuel's gaze swept the crowd one final time. "You know the truth now," he said. "What you do with it is up to you." As the crowd began to disperse, Hattie stood quietly beside Samuel. Her hand brushed the casket one last time. "He carried so much," she whispered. "I hope they're ready to carry it now." Samuel's gaze softened. "They are," he said, "because now they know what it truly means to live a life of service." Hattie nodded, her heart lifting despite the weight of loss. Robert was gone, but his legacy had only just begun. As the last of the mourners drifted away from the gravesite, a quiet calm settled over Cypress Grove Cemetery. Hattie and Samuel remained, standing side by side, their hands lightly touching as they gazed down at Robert's resting place. The weight of the day's revelations lingered, but there was also a quiet strength in the air, a sense that Robert's story had not ended here, but had instead ignited something deeper in those who had heard it. Samuel took a breath, his eyes softening. "They'll carry his legacy," he said quietly, "not because they have to, but because they understand it now." Hattie's gaze remained fixed on the polished headstone. "Robert never needed recognition," she whispered, "but maybe now he has it." Her voice tightened, "And maybe that's enough." Samuel's hand curled around hers. "It's not about recognition," he said. "It's about knowing that his sacrifices meant something." A light breeze stirred the air, rustling the grass at their feet. Hattie's lips curved into a faint smile. "He always said that strength isn't in what you achieve, it's in what you give." Her gaze lifted toward Samuel, and he gave everything. Samuel nodded, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. "And now, it's our turn." Hattie exhaled slowly. "Yes," she said, "it's time." They turned toward the path leading out of the cemetery. Behind them, Robert's headstone gleamed beneath the afternoon sun, a silent reminder of a life that had touched more hearts than anyone had ever realized. His legacy wasn't written in the accolades or the polished image that others had admired. It was written in the lives he had quietly lifted. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. If you believe Robert's story left a powerful lesson, comment 1 below. If you think there's more we can improve, comment 2. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next powerful story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.